Today, I will tell you about the terrible death of King Henry VIII of England, one of the most powerful but also most tragic rulers in history. However, to understand this story, we must first know what kind of youth he had, because Henry's death was not only the physical collapse of a man, but also the decay of an empire's glory. Henry VIII was born on June 28, 1491, as the shining star of the Tudor dynasty. He was known as the most handsome prince in Europe at a young age. He attracted attention with his tall stature, athletic build, red gold hair, and elegant demeanor. An ambassador from Venice wrote that he was more handsome than any prince in the Christian world. He was talented in many areas, from music composition to sports. When he ascended the throne at the age of 17, he was seen as the ideal Renaissance prince of Europe. He was a figure admired by everyone for his power, intelligence, and charm. But this sparkling beginning would eventually give way to a dark tragedy, because history sometimes witnesses the swift demise of even the brightest stars. The turning point in Henry's life came on a cold January day in 1536, at a grand tournament held at Greenwich Palace. England's powerful king rode into the arena on horseback, clad in armor, in a magnificent display. The crowd held its breath. That moment was not merely a sporting event, but a ceremony symbolizing England's power. However, luck can change the fate of even the most powerful kings in an instant. As Henry rode swiftly toward his opponent, he suddenly lost control. The two warhorses collided. The huge warhorse fell and landed on Henry, who was wearing armor. The force of the collision was equivalent to a car accident. The king lay motionless on the ground before the eyes of the large crowd. He remained unconscious for 2 hours. Panic ensued at the palace. Had the ruler of England died? Anne Boleyn was pregnant, and all eyes were on the unborn child. England suddenly faced the danger of being left without a throne. Henry finally opened his eyes, but nothing would ever be the same again. His right leg had been severely crushed in the accident. The wound would not heal. It became an open sore, festering for years, and filled with pus. These wounds were not merely a physical torment. They also caused a horrific odor that poisoned the air of the palace. So much so that the king's presence could be detected from several rooms away before he even entered. Even a facial expression of disgust at the smell was considered an insult to the king and could be punished with death. From that day onward, both Henry's body and soul began to decay. The accident changed not only his health, but also his character. Henry, who had previously been known as a charming and cultured ruler, gradually became paranoid, angry, and cruel. Historians believe that the concussion destabilized him. Shortly after the accident, he had his second wife, Anne Boleyn, executed on fabricated charges. The old, cheerful, and poetic prince was gone. In his place was a tyrant who did not hesitate to shed blood and was prone to sudden outbursts of anger. But the biggest change was happening to his body. His waist, which used to be slim and athletic, quickly went from 90 centimeters to 130 centimeters. He weighed over 180 kilograms. He got so fat that they had to set up a special pulley system to move him from room to room in the palace. They even had to widen the doors. Meals rich in meat, totaling 5,000 calories a day, only exacerbated the situation. Hundreds of chefs worked in the palace kitchen every day, solely to prepare the king's meals. However, this opulence served no purpose other than to accelerate his downfall. This is how the first steps were taken in Henry VIII's transformation from Golden Age prince to decaying tyrant. And this transformation would lead him to one of the most horrific deaths in history. In the years following the accident, Henry VIII's body and spirit began to rapidly decline. The once handsome prince now struggled even to walk. Court officials used pulley systems and special chairs to move him from room to room. Henry's weight had increased so much that the doors at Hampton Court Palace had to be rebuilt and the ceiling beams reinforced. He was now almost a prisoner, confined to the prison of his own body. But the most terrifying aspect was the wounds on his legs that would not heal. These wounds had become so severe that pus-filled discharge constantly oozed out, and even the bones were visible. The court physicians tried the methods of the time in desperation: cauterization with hot iron, mixtures of mercury and arsenic, constant bloodletting. None of it worked. In fact, most of them made Henry's condition even worse. Approaching the king's chamber was unbearable. The stench was repulsive. Yet most court officials could not enter without holding perfumed handkerchiefs to their noses. At times, even the strongest nobles fainted and fell to the ground. The pain in his body darkened his soul. Henry's anger was now like a storm. One day he would smile and give gifts, and the next day he would throw the same people into prison. After marrying Anne Boleyn, he married Catherine Howard, and the age difference between them had become grotesque. A king over 50, obese and wounded, facing a cheerful young woman of 19. Catherine tried to find solace by fleeing her husband and seeking comfort with a young courtier. When this secret affair was discovered, Henry had them both executed. The throne had been built on blood and fear. The king's appetite also spiraled out of control along with his illness. According to kitchen records, he consumed an average of 5,000 calories a day. His table was overflowing with lamb, pork, venison, various meat pies, huge fried dishes, and wine. Vegetables, however, were almost non-existent. Henry believed that certain foods possessed mystical powers. He thought that swan meat would grant him elegance, deer meat would enhance his hunting skills, and oysters would bestow sexual strength. For this reason, he never allowed these foods to be absent from his table. But his diet was not only making him obese, it was also weighing down his spirit. He had difficulty breathing at night and suffered from fits of rage during the day. Modern historians believe that he probably struggled with diabetes, gout, and heart failure. As infections spread through his body and reached his brain, hallucinations began to appear. Henry frequently spoke to his deceased enemies and the wives he had executed, shouting at an empty corner of the room. The French ambassador wrote that the king suddenly stood up at a banquet and shouted at an empty chair, "Get out," which, "I killed you once, and I'll kill you again." Everyone at court knew these words were directed at the imaginary Anne Boleyn, but Henry's biggest problem was his endless paranoia. He was so afraid of being poisoned that he had several servants taste every meal first, then waited half an hour to make sure they didn't die before sitting down to eat. Not only food, but medicines and even ointments applied to his wounds were first tested on servants. In the palace kitchens, everything from spices to water was tested separately. Henry couldn't even relax in his bed at night. He kept daggers under his pillow and crossbows by his side. The fact that his room was filled with secret passages helped ease his fears a little. But the most painful truth was that he couldn't trust even those closest to him. He believed that even his own daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, were plotting to assassinate him, so he placed spies around them. All this paranoia turned the palace into a reign of terror. People knew that even the slightest wrong look could mean a death sentence. In his final years, he had many of his friends and advisors executed on charges of treason. Just 9 days before his death, he even had Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, one of his closest confidants, beheaded. He constantly bathed those around him in blood to maintain his power. But in truth, it was not power that remained, but fear. For Henry VIII was no longer a ruler, but a ghost, haunted by the stench of rotting flesh and endless suffering. And so, this dark shadow would lead him to his final and most terrifying days. In the final days of 1546, Whitehall Palace resembled a hospital more than a palace. The heavy odor emanating from Henry's room filled the stone corridors of the palace. Although the curtains were decorated with incense, roses, and spices, nothing could mask the smell of the decaying body. Court officials could not enter without holding a handkerchief soaked in perfume to their noses, and some fainted from the smell and fell to the ground. No one could remember the once handsome, golden-haired prince. Before them lay only a swollen, wound-covered giant, struggling to breathe. The wounds on Henry's legs had now turned gangrenous. The gangrenous tissue had darkened, and the pus had penetrated to the bones. The bedsheets had to be changed multiple times a day, and each time, the servants in the room would faint. The king had grown so heavy that it took 6 strong men to turn him over in bed. His liver was swollen, his eyes were yellow, and his tongue was so swollen that his speech had become incomprehensible. Most of the time, he could only manage to utter hoarse grunts, but the most terrifying thing was the darkness in his mind. Henry often said that he saw the ghosts of his dead wives and friends whom he had executed. Sometimes he would stare at an empty corner and shout, "Mother, go away." Other times he would call out to his first wife, Catherine, begging, "Forgive me." It was even recorded that he would cry while reciting the names of his deceased children. As the body decayed, the soul was shattered into pieces. On January 15, 1547, everyone knew that the end was near, but no one dared to mention the king's death. According to English law, even mentioning the king's death in advance was considered treason. Doctors pretended there was still hope, and courtiers said, "His Majesty will recover soon." However, Henry's body reeked of death, even while he was still alive. On the night of January 27th, disaster struck. Henry suffered a major stroke. One side of his face collapsed, his tongue swelled, and his arms and legs became immobile. He could no longer speak, only making gurgling sounds. To fulfill his last wish, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer of Canterbury was summoned to his bedside. Cranmer said to Henry, "If you believe in Jesus, take my hand." The king, who no longer had the strength to speak, weakly squeezed Cranmer's hand. This was the last movement he made while conscious. On the morning of January 28, 1547, Henry VIII, aged 55, breathed his last with a rasping breath. But the story doesn't end there. Even Henry's death did not bring peace. His enormous, decaying body was a nightmare for the undertakers. Since he did not fit into a normal coffin, a special coffin was made. His internal organs were removed and replaced with herbs and spices. However, his body was so badly decomposed that even these measures could not stop the smell. The gases inside the coffin began to build up quickly. While being transported to Windsor for the funeral, the coffin was left overnight in a monastery. That night, a terrible incident occurred. The sides of the coffin cracked under the pressure of the gas. The putrid liquid leaked onto the floor. In the morning, dogs were seen licking the liquid. The king, who once claimed to be God's representative on earth, had ultimately suffered the greatest humiliation before street animals. On February 16, 1547, Henry was finally buried in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. Only one woman was laid to rest beside him, his third wife, Jane Seymour. She was the only person who had given birth to a legitimate male heir, Edward. But in a cruel twist of fate, Edward was only able to remain on the throne for 6 years. Henry's dream of a male heir, for which he had plunged the country into bloodshed, was short-lived. The throne passed to his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth. Especially Elizabeth, unlike her father, would usher in a golden age for England. The death of Henry VIII was not merely the end of a man, it was also the collapse of the image of absolute royal power. Once known as the most handsome prince in Europe, Henry, who was powerful enough to stand up to the Pope, had ultimately become a prisoner of his decaying body. His story serves as a lesson, reminding us that human power is not limitless, for even the most powerful kings are equal before death. And Henry's end went down in history as one of the most horrific and cautionary deaths ever recorded.